It is St. Mary's week with the Gaels in town on Saturday night, and Zach Farmer and I break down why this game is as important of a regular season game the Zags have had in a really long time.
You are Locked On Zags, your daily podcast on the Gonzaga Bulldogs. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
What is going on, y'all? Welcome into the Locked On Zags podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm your host and longtime Gonzaga podcaster, Andy Patton, here to provide news and updates on all things Zag athletics. Today's episode of Locked On Zags is brought to you by FanDuel. Make every moment more. Folks, right now, new customers can join today, and you'll get $200 in bonus bets if your first bet of $5 or more wins. Visit FanDuel.com/LockedOn today to get started. Well, it is the day before the big game between Gonzaga and St. Mary's on Saturday night. I am thrilled to be joined today by Zach Farmer. He is the host of the unofficial WCC Hoops podcast. It is the best WCC coverage that exists out there. Definitely give him a follow. Unofficial WCC Hoops pod. Can you spell out the exact Twitter handle for the show there, Zach?
Unoff WCC pod. So UNOFF yes. WCC pod.
It is also
I couldn't make it any longer. Twitter wouldn't let me, so that's where I had to go.
Got to do what you got to do. Seriously, fantastic WCC coverage. Zach is also a St. Mary's fan, so it is a perfect person to help us get coverage of this team. And Zach, I kind of want to try to format this show somewhat similarly to how I do, especially for the listeners out there, how I do the normal kind of game preview shows. So we talk about the team that Gonzaga is playing in the first segment. We'll talk about the 5 keys to a victory for Gonzaga. We'll talk about some of those keys for St. Mary's as well. And then we're going to close out the show talking about why this game is so important for both teams, the lack of quad one wins for Gonzaga, the at-large resumes for both these teams, and so on and so forth. But I want to start with the game that St. Mary's played on Wednesday evening against Santa Clara. One of the concerns that you and I had, we spoke earlier in the week, was whether either of these two teams would potentially fall victim to a trap game, getting ready for that game against each other on Saturday. Gonzaga had no problems with LMU, absolutely blew them out of the water, out of the gates. And it looked like St. Mary's was kind of rolling towards the same thing, doubled up Santa Clara, a very, very good team, as Gonzaga fans know. Had them doubled up at halftime, and then the final score ended up being much, much closer as Santa Clara scored 55 points in the second half against the Gaels. What happened in that comeback? And was it a situation of St. Mary's letting off the gas, you think, or is it just kind of a product of Santa Clara being a pretty darn good basketball team?
I think it's a little bit of column A, a little bit of column B.
Mm-hmm.
I think St. Mary's got up to such a, especially almost the ease in which they kind of took command of that game. It was 15-0 at one point in this contest. And we've seen Santa Clara, this happened to Santa Clara recently, as the Pepperdine game just last week, this similar thing happened to them and they roared back in that game too. So maybe this is Santa Clara the last week or so. That's just kind of what they've been doing. But also, grand scheme of things, this kind of ended up the game I thought it would be. Santa Clara was going to play better than they did that first time around. They had a full week to prepare for St. Mary's. They very clearly were upset and about the way that first game went, because they were a lot more energized early on. It was chippy early on, chippy throughout the game, really. And so you could clearly tell that Santa Clara kind of took that first game personally and really wanted to come out and play well. And obviously we didn't see that in the first half, but they came out strong in the second. And really, that was Carlos Marshall Jr. He played really well in that second half, 23 points. Adama Ball, he had a couple of threes late in that contest that only Adama Ball could hit. And it got them back in that game. And yes, I do think St. Mary's kind of let off the gas a bit. They got a little bit disjointed. Josh Jefferson fouled out with about 2 or 3 minutes left in that ball game. But they found enough ways to kind of get through it. Aidan Mahaney also did not have that good of a game either. He was 2 for 8 from the field. So kind of back-to-back poor game for him. But Augustas Marciulionis has been kind of the go-to guy in those situations of late. He had 20 Against Santa Clara, 6 assists. He had 25 the other night against LMU.
Mm-hmm.
So he has really been kind of like, I think, that leader. And Alex Dukas has come through in clutch scenarios as well the last night, and then also as of late.
Yeah, so that's a perfect transition into what I wanted to talk about more. Was I think for folks who have been paying attention to college basketball, certainly Gonzaga fans are used to paying a lot of attention to St. Mary's. They'll remember a really bad start to the season. I mean, there's no other way to phrase it. They lost games they shouldn't lose. They lost that Weber State game. They struggled against teams that they had no business struggling against, and and knocked them out of the rankings. And similar thing happened to Gonzaga in a slightly kind of slower scale, but both teams had these higher preseason expectations that they kind of failed to meet in the non-conference. And lately, though, if anybody has kind of stopped paying attention to St. Mary's, they have really righted the ship in a significant way. 13 of their last 14 games, they are the only undefeated remaining team in the WCC. Obviously, some struggles against Santa Clara. They've had some close games. I think LMU, both games against LMU were within 5 points. Like, it hasn't necessarily been just complete destroying everybody in the WCC, although they certainly have had their fair share of those against Pacific and San Francisco in particular. But what about it? And you mentioned Marcelonis, and I think he's probably the key piece here in terms of what has really turned this team around, because Mahaney was struggling early in the year, and he's still been somewhat inconsistent, hasn't had that sophomore breakout that I think people maybe expected. But it feels like Marcelonis is probably the biggest key for this team's winning 13 of their last 14 games and really kind of putting themselves back in that at-large conversation, back in that top 25 conversation.
Yes, I think Augustus Marcelonis is definitely one of the guys who has been a key part to that. But I think you look at this way in almost 2 seasons. What we saw from St. Mary's very early on was a team that was almost over-reliant on Aidan Mahaney to kind of be the offense. And you also saw a bunch of guys who maybe weren't quite sure of what their role was. And I think that's what we saw with Marcelonis. He didn't quite know where he fit. Josh Jefferson wasn't quite confident in what he was supposed to be doing. I think you could make the same case for, I'm going to say Alex Dukas. Alex Dukas has been there for so long. He kind of knows what his role is, but he just has been struggling with back problems most of the season, the same injury that he had last year at the end. So that's also been something that kind of held this team back, because really it was all piled on one guy to lead that offense. And the change really has been the play of everybody else. We've seen Augustus Marcelonis find his role, find his rhythm, and it's really kind of like he's taken the lead. He's now kind of like grasped that I'm going to be the leader now, and we're going to go. I think that's been a huge part. I'm thinking, last I checked, since that Colorado State game, he's averaging like 15 and 7. So that's 15.7 assists has been about his averages since then. Josh Jefferson has also been another one of those keys. Again, another guy you talk about sophomore season, and you just look to see that leap. We're starting to see that leap from him. He's becoming a much more reliable shooter. Early on, he was awful shooting the ball, especially from 3. I think he was like 2 for 27 at one point on the season. And now he looked way more comfortable out there. The touch is there. And that's largely from what my understanding is, that he's being allowed to play more free. He tried to fit in what he thought he was supposed to do. Now he's being allowed to kind of just be who he is. And that's really freed him up to be a lot better for the squad. And I want to talk more about Mitchell Saxen, because I think like he's obviously like a huge component to this, because he's the center. He's their defensive anchor back there. He's also been great offensively. But one of the guys off the bench, I think once he found his role, has been critical, has been Luke Barrett. I think the role that he has played in this resurgence of St. Mary's cannot be overlooked. He has been he is the hustle guy. He's going to be the unsung hero. He's been their leading scorer a couple of times, but it's bonus what you get from Luke Barrett. But he's been so critical to what they've been able to do on both sides of the ball that Randy Bennett's put a lot of trust in him. He's now in that first 6-7 rotation, and he's there every night now.
Pace is always the name of the game when Gonzaga and St. Mary's meet, and we're going to discuss that. We're also going to discuss some other keys to the game, what Gonzaga could do to secure a victory, what St. Mary's needs to do if they want to secure a victory, all of that coming up after a word from today's sponsor, FanDuel. The Super Bowl is coming up. It is San Francisco, Kansas City. There is still time for folks to get in on the action with FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. because right now new customers can get $200 in bonus bets guaranteed when you win a $5 bet. That's $200 in your pocket if your first bet wins. The FanDuel app is super easy to use. There are so many different ways to bet, like their live same-game parlays, finding bets in the new Explore tab, or making a parlay in the very popular Parlay Hub, the best way to find popular parlays. Right now, the Gonzaga women, 24,000 to 1 odds to win the national championship. I have seen the way they are playing right now, and I think I'm willing to take that bet. If you want to join me, visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and make your first bet a layup. FanDuel, an official partner of the NFL. All right, Zach, want to talk keys to the game here. And you kind of touched on a few of them there at the end, which was perfect. I think St. Mary's' depth and Gonzaga's depth are both in kind of an interesting spot. Luke Barrett has been a huge part of that for St. Mary's. Dusty Stromer switching to a role coming off the bench has been a big part of that for Gonzaga as well. And we can get into that. But really, for me, when you talk keys to a Gonzaga victory against St. Mary's, or really vice versa, it's always going to come down to pace. Because the games that St. Mary's has won over the years, whether it was in Las Vegas, whether it was in Moraga, whether it was in Spokane, have often been because they have been effectively able to slow down Gonzaga and make them play at their pace. There have also been times where Randy Bennett has successfully slowed down Gonzaga and the Zags still win, but that is a much more difficult game. Now, this Gonzaga team doesn't run as much as previous Gonzaga teams. They don't have the personnel, they don't have the depth to do it as often. We've also seen many teams make adjustments to kind of trying to prevent Gonzaga from getting out, but their recent success that the Zags have had against LMU, the success against Pepperdine and San Diego, has been in part because they've been trying to get out more. KenPom has St. Mary's as the 356th team in tempo. That's basically last. Is that what we can expect to see from St. Mary's, is this slow pace, this kind of methodical offense? And how do you think Gonzaga, if you think they're capable of counteracting that, and how big of a key do you think that is for this game?
I mean, as you pointed out, pace is really the key to this matchup. If this ends up being more of a St. Mary's game, and yes, I think they're going to try to be very deliberate on that front. And that really starts with their defense. They are just going to try to clamp you down and just essentially eliminate any level of offense. We saw that last night against Santa Clara. It took Santa Clara almost 7 minutes to score their first point.
Yeah.
So you clearly see, like, this is the game plan. Like, this is what St. Mary's is going to try to do. They don't have the best athletes, but they just know how to help on defense really well. They're good. They're great at staying in front of their guys. They know how to create tough passing lanes. This is what they know how to do. And one of the things we know that Gonzaga also likes to do is be able to move the ball around and actually have that flow of offense, which this is something that St. Mary's is largely able to disrupt on a lot of fronts. And so I think, like, that's really the challenge for Gonzaga, is to get off to that good offensive start and have that rhythm early, like we saw against LMU. Because I think, like, over the last few weeks, we hadn't seen that from them. We've seen a lot of rough first halves, whether we point to Pepperdine, we point to USF game, point to Santa Clara. It's like a lot of those games, it was like, even Pacific, it's like slow first halves, and then they picked up in the second. In my mind, it's like, if Gonzaga is going to be in this game early and off, you have to have that strong start in the first half, because if you don't, unlike a USF, unlike a Pacific, unlike a Santa Clara, they will not let you back in the game. You start slow. St. Mary's knows how to clamp you down and then finish it off.
Yeah, absolutely. I think Gonzaga has played, when they don't play a full 40 against Santa Clara, they lose. When they don't play a full 40 against San Francisco, they barely win. Like, they cannot afford to not play a full 40 against St. Mary's. There's just no way. They have to be in it the entire game. I think that's unquestionably a part of it. And we can talk about, like, specific X's and O's and various other things, but ultimately it's about Gonzaga not falling victim to having a slow start in the second half, having a weird period late in the first half, which is what caught them against Santa Clara. They played them okay in the first 12 minutes or so, and then really struggled to finish out the second half. Like, they just are going to need to be able to avoid that. And I think, it's going to be a chess match, as it always is. And I think what has happened to Gonzaga in the past is teams have game planned differently against them, and Gonzaga has struggled to adjust. And I don't know that that's as much of a play in this game because I think both teams kind of know what the other is going to do. It's just going to kind of be a, hey, who can make those little in-game adjustments and figure things out, and also just who's going to out execute the other team. I don't think it's like St. Mary's is probably not going to throw anything super unusual at Gonzaga. I doubt Gonzaga is going to throw anything unusual at St. Mary's. We saw them do a few things kind of differently in the LMU game. I think partly because they knew that Dominic Harris knew some of their actions, and so they threw something a little different at them, and it worked really excellently, having Nolan Hickman run that pick and roll instead of Ryan Nembhard having them run it a little closer to the basket. It seemed to free up some stuff that I'm not sure how effective those particular actions would be against St. Mary's, but I do think there's an element of you just got to be who's going to execute their offense, their sets, their defensive schemes better. I think that's what this game's going to come down to, and it kind of just feels like a clash of two titans in some ways.
Yeah, I mean, the one thing I really liked from Gonzaga the other night was the switch in strategy, as far as they really emphasize attacking the basket and getting into the paint in that game against LMU. Because the one thing we know, like season long, Gonzaga has not been that good of a 3-point shooting team. And sometimes there's been an over-reliance on the perimeter shooting. They did not rely on that at all, especially there in the first half. And it really put the pressure on LMU, and they were clearly unable to respond to what the Zags were able to do. Graham Ike had a great game. Nolan Hickman attacking the basket, he had a great game. Anton Watson, as we know, it's like especially once he has a head of steam toward the basket, he's tough to stop. That was the one thing I think that was a really nice adjustment for them to have that be the game plan. But as you pointed out, St. Mary's is a completely different team on that front. They are great on the interior defense. Rebounding, I think, is also going to be another key in this one, because these are two of the best rebounding teams in the country, and St. Mary's has been one of the best offensive rebounding teams in the country all year long. And if anything, that might be one of the bigger keys, because that's where St. Mary's has made a lot of their living this year, is on the offensive glass. And if they do lead in that category, if they control the glass, this feels like it's going to be a tough sled for Gonzaga, as it was against Santa Clara and also against USF, because similar things that they were out rebounded in those contests.
It's funny. You're not looking at my notes, but it feels like you might be looking at my notes, because I literally have "cannot let Gaels get second chance opportunities" bolded and italicized in my notes, because for me, that does feel like a key, especially with the pace thing. Like if St. Mary's is getting offensive rebounds, they're taking entire full minutes off the clock of a 30-second clock, get a shot up. And the amount of times Gonzaga this year has played, because their defense is great. It's one of the best defenses we've seen from them in a while. And it's kind of this under talked about aspect of Gonzaga. And we really saw it against LMU. I mean, that LMU team just kept coughing up the basketball, and St. Mary's is not going to cough up the ball nearly as much as LMU did, because they're just a more tight offensive team. But like, if Gonzaga is going to play great defense for 30 seconds, force Alex Dukas to take an off-balance three with the shot clock expiring, and then Mitchell Saxen gets an offensive rebound and resets the offense, like, that is just draining for you as a defense. It's exhausting. It's deflating to the crowd. And like, we've seen Gonzaga do that against teams that aren't as good as St. Mary's. So to me, the rebounding is huge. And I spoke with Chris Gerlison before the San Francisco game, and he said that in his mind, that was the biggest key for his team in terms of being able to pull off an upset. And guess what? San Francisco out-rebounded Gonzaga, and they came this close to pulling off an upset. So that is a key against Gonzaga. They start three bigs, and yet they have been getting out-rebounded. They got out-rebounded by LMU. That's part of that was because LMU missed a lot more shots than Gonzaga and was able to get more rebounds. But yeah, it to me, that is a really big key. And I think you're absolutely right that keeping St. Mary's off the offensive glass is a big key for Gonzaga. The hard part is if you have to crash hard on the defensive glass, you're less likely to be able to get out in transition, which is also what I think is a key for Gonzaga. So they kind of have to pick their battles if they're going to crash really hard to make sure Saxen and Jefferson and Dukas and those guys aren't getting offensive boards. They're probably sacrificing their ability to get out in transition, which potentially means they have to be more reliant on the half-court offense, which the half-court offense for Gonzaga comes down to two players, Graham Ike and Anton Watson. In your mind, if St. Mary's is to lose, if Gonzaga is going to win this game, what do you think needs to happen? And who among those players in particular do you think needs to be the biggest X factor, the biggest contributor for Gonzaga to be able to ensure a victory at the Kennel and St. Mary's is win streak in the WCC?
Yeah, I mean, I would think for Gonzaga, the key is going to be trying to speed St. Mary's up. Even if it's in short spurts, it's speeding that team up, because one of the things we've seen over the course of time, and actually we saw it last night against Santa Clara, is that the St. Mary's team was bothered still, as a lot of times is, by the press. And if you continue to have that sort of action, that can be a way you speed St. Mary's up into something they may not be as comfortable doing. Now, they were able to break the press a few times and actually make Santa Clara pay, but that still seems like a way to at least get like the Aidan Mahaney's off of his game and start to force him into some poor decisions. But poor decision making is just not something that the St. Mary's team does all that often. I was taking a look at the stats. They've only had more than 10 turnovers once in the last 7 games. Jeez. So this is not a team that's going to make a ton of mistakes. The one game was 12 against USF. But it's been 4, 5, 7, 12, 9, 4, 9. It's like this St. Mary's team takes care of the basketball. So I think trying to force them into quicker action, I think, is the way to do it. And as far as an X factor of who I think is going to have to play a big game, this has to be like a big game for Nolan Hickman in my mind. I think he is going to have to really come through, much like he did against LMU, because he played with so much energy. That was one of the best games I've seen from him, maybe ever. So I think you don't need that level of game. You don't need 24 points from Nolan Hickman, but you do need him to come through in clutch spots. You do need him to play well defensively. He's a guy I think that is going to be absolutely critical for Gonzaga to pull off a win in this one, because everybody else feels like there's kind of almost like you can kind of predict maybe where the advantage is in places. That's the one where it's like, if he can play maybe above where we are used to seeing him and more like the other night, then that gives Gonzaga the win.
Well, one of the things that's kind of made this game particularly interesting is Gonzaga's vulnerability. I mean, they're more vulnerable right now than they've been in a long time, since really that 2015-16 team, in terms of, ensuring that they have a spot in the NCAA tournament, that they're going to be continuing that incredibly lengthy streak of participating in the big dance. St. Mary's obviously has a lot of momentum, but because of that rough start to the season, they're kind of not in a position of as much comfort and haven't, frankly, gotten as much respect from the committee as I think Gonzaga probably would, just part of name value in that way. And that certainly there's a debate about how that should be perceived. I mean, St. Mary's resume right now has more quad 1 wins than Gonzaga, because Gonzaga does not have any, but it does make this feel, in particular, this game, the return game in Moraga, obviously the WCC tournament, they feel heightened in a way that we haven't really seen in a while. And part of that is because even though the last few years these teams have been good and comparable, they both were going to make the NCAA tournament. Like, it didn't feel like there was as much mystery about that. And now that's a big situation. Gonzaga's going for their first quad 1 game. St. Mary's is going for the kind of victory that would really cement their resume as we're kind of getting into February and the start of the bubble season, as it were. Does it feel to you like this game has a little bit more juice to it? Does it? Because to me, it feels like Gonzaga's a little bit more desperate, and that might be kind of a scary situation for St. Mary's. But at the same time, the flip side could be this: St. Mary's smells blood, and they're going to go in for the kill. And it kind of feels like it could go either way, and makes it exciting, and also the kind of game where my stomach's going to be turning for the entire day on Saturday.
I think that there is going to be something to be said about the Zags playing with their back against the wall to an extent, and how that does create a little bit more of a dangerous opponent, because when you're playing somebody who has something to play for and it is legitimately now needs it, I think that's completely legitimate. I think that's going to be very much part of the case on Saturday. But on the St. Mary's side, like, I think they've been playing that way since about the first week of December. Since they lost to Weber State, since that first net ranking came out where they were 155, they've been playing that way. They have been playing focused and with a chip on their shoulder of nobody believes in us. Like, probably some of the things I've even said about
have made
it back to that locker room. But So I think like they've been playing that way for a long time. And I think that that's given them a little bit of an edge that they're not afraid to actually go into any building and really kind of take the air out of places. Keep in mind, they're the only undefeated college basketball team left at 5-0 in true road games.
Mm-hmm.
So this is another kind of random note. It's like they've gone on the road. They've won at Santa Clara. They won at USF. They won at Colorado State. They won at LMU. It's like they have big wins against some good opponents on the road. And obviously, like, this may be the toughest of them, hitting the road against the Zags. As we know, the Kennel is just is a tough place to win, no matter how good the Zags are. But I think St. Mary's is battle tested enough, and they've been playing with a chip on their shoulder, maybe for a little longer than the Zags have so far this year. But both these teams playing with a little bit of desperation, with no guarantee, I think is going to give this game a new wrinkle that we haven't seen, or at least a different wrinkle we haven't seen in a long time.
Yeah, I'm with you 100%. And it feels to me like St. Mary's should be in the at-large conversation if they don't win the WCC. I think Gonzaga should be in the at-large conversation if they don't win the WCC. But if either of these teams get swept by each other, that I think puts this conversation in a much more tenuous spot. Gonzaga has that opportunity against Kentucky. Kentucky has looked far more vulnerable lately, but that's still, frankly, a really tough matchup for Gonzaga just from a personnel perspective. But it does feel like both these teams have some absolute juice. Zach, before I let you go, I just want a game prediction. It doesn't have to be an exact score, but something about how you think this game might go. How you think the final score is going to shake out, what this thing might look like on Saturday, because it's going to be a really fun one.
Yeah, I get the feeling this is going to be more of a St. Mary's pace in this one. The way they've been playing the last couple months, I just have a ton of confidence in that squad right now. And Gonzaga's been playing better as of late, I think, as well. But so I think this is going to be a lower scoring game, but St. Mary's, I think, is going to pull off their first win in Spokane since 2018. They'll snap that 5-game losing streak and take really full command of the WCC if they're able to get it.
Yeah. Well, I'll predict Gonzaga so that we're not both predicting St. Mary's. I think it's going to be a close game. I think it's going to be a game played more at St. Mary's' pace. I think Gonzaga is a little bit more comfortable playing at that pace than they have been in the past, which might be a bit of an advantage for them. But I do still think that the matchup on the block, Ike and Saxen, is going to be a key part of it. How Watson can perform. We've seen him have huge games for Gonzaga when Ike's been neutralized in the past, like he did against Santa Clara, like he did against UCLA. If Ike can avoid foul trouble and command Saxon's attention, and Watson can do what he does, I think this Gonzaga team has a great opportunity to kind of maintain a 6 to 8 point lead throughout the game. Then at the end of the game, they got to make their free throws, and boy, howdy, has that been a problem for them this season. But if they're able
for both teams on that front,
yeah, that's true. It's been an issue for St. Mary's as well. This could be a slow-paced game that ends with a bunch of teams bricking free throws at the end. Might not be the most fun aesthetically if that ends up happening, but I think Gonzaga can hang on for a 6-8 point victory here and get that first quad one win and make the standings a little bit closer. But I'll tell you right now, it is not going to be a game where either team feels particularly comfortable for probably any of the 40 minutes in this contest.
I think everyone watching is going to lose a few years off their lives like watching this game.
Yeah, if I had any hair left to lose, it'd be gone. I promise you that. Zach, thank you so much, as always, for coming onto the show. I always appreciate your expertise, your insight into this team. I'm looking forward to a fantastic game on Saturday and getting an opportunity to speak with you again later in the season when these two teams face off again and potentially to help preview the WCC tournament.
Sounds good. Thanks, Andy.
Yep, that's going to wrap it up for us today here on the Locked On Zags podcast. If you want to make this show your first listen or your first watch of the day, please hit that subscribe button on YouTube. It is very much appreciated. And until next time, as always, especially this week, go Zags.